Today we're going to talk about palettes. Remind me to empty my wet palette before I do that next time. Hi guys, Jonathan from Two Raven Studios, and now that I got myself soaking wet from holding up my wet palette that was full of water, let's start today's video. So if you're new here, welcome. Please subscribe. We do new videos every week and you don't want to miss out. So this is going to be a continuation of my series on painting basics. So we already kind of went over a bunch of basic stuff like brushes, and now the other big key is the palette, what you put the paint on. So we're going to go over three main things. The first thing is stuff you probably have in your house you can use as a palette. The second is what I'm going to call hard palettes, and then in the end we're going to talk about wet palettes. So before we start, why do we use a palette? I mean, we could just pull the paint right out of the bottle and paint right from there. The reason we want to use a palette is when you pull the paint right out of the bottle, you really have no control over the consistency and thickness of that paint. And depending on the technique you want, there's different consistencies that you probably want in the paint. So by using a palette, we can thin it to the level that we want. So if I am doing something like dry brushing, I want that paint nice and thick. So maybe I don't need the palette, I can come right out of the bottle. But if I'm doing any kind of blending, I definitely want some thinner paint. And the palette's going to help me control how thin that paint is. So like I said, we're going to do three different types of palettes. So let's start out with stuff you probably have around your house that you could use as a palette. So first, let's talk about stuff you have around your house that you could use as a palette. What is going to make a good palette? Well, pretty much any surface that's not going to absorb the paint into it is going to work as a palette. So we want something that we can put the paint on top of, and the paint's not going to soak into that surface. It's going to be on top of the surface, and we can mix it, add water to it, and that sort of stuff. So with that in mind, the easiest thing to use, and something probably everyone has in their house, is just a simple paper plate. Paper plates are normally coated with something so stuff doesn't soak into them, so you can put your paint on here, you can mix in water and that sort of stuff, and it will work really well as a simple palette. The problem with the paper plate is, though, it's going to be something disposable. Maybe that's a problem for you, maybe it's not, but after a while it's going to get covered with paint and you're going to have to get a new plate. Paper plates are cheap, so if you don't care, you can just throw it out in your new one. Something else that you could use as also disposable, which I actually use a lot for painting, but not in this manner, but it works in this manner, is parchment paper. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but if you just set a piece of parchment paper down, you can put the paint on, thin it down if you have to, and parchment paper, again, it's another thing that's disposable that works great as a palette. Now maybe you want something that's not going to be disposable, something that you can clean and just keep reusing. So for that, this is something you may or may not have lying around your house, and that is a tile. So if you've had any kind of tile work done in your kitchen, bathroom, that sort of thing, maybe you have an extra piece of tile lying around, these make great palettes. So nothing's going to get absorbed into it. This one actually has a very nice surface. Something with a glossier surface is going to be better, but I've used all kinds of tiles over the years. This is actually what I use as my palette for a very, very long time, is this piece of tile. You can see there's a little piece of paint here, but what I normally do is when it gets too gunked up, I just put some Simple Green or something like that on it and just scrub that paint off, and it's brand new. So again, a piece of tile is something that's reusable that you can use that you might have lying around. Three things that you might have lying around your house that I would recommend is, if you have a piece of tile, it's a great thing to use. If you want something that's more disposable, you can go with the parchment paper or just a paper plate. But maybe you want to buy something specifically. So we're going to get into what I personally use and what I recommend for a palette. If you're starting out painting, the first thing you should buy out to use as a palette is just a simple little well palette. So this is a small one. It has just 6 little wells here. You can get bigger ones like this that have a bunch of different wells, and white balance helps me. There we go. You can see it's got all these different wells around there. So I mainly use this one, but I have this one too. These palettes are just plastic and they're actually very inexpensive. So you can just go to any craft store, art store, and get yourself something like this. I highly recommend it. They also make metal versions. I use this one a lot. If you watch my videos, you probably see this palette in almost every video. This is for when I oil paint. I'm going to leave a link up here where I talk about it more in detail, but when you oil paint, you want something that is either metal or glass. You don't want the plastic because the solvents you use too thin the oil paints are going to eat away at the plastic, so you want something metal. Just like brushes, you can use the same palette for your oils and your acrylics, but if they're not cleaned properly, you're going to have a problem. And since oils require a metal palette anyway, I have this metal palette that I'll dedicate it to oils, and then I have this palette that I use when I do acrylics. And then the last type of palette is, I'm not going to tilt it like I did last time, your wet palette. So this is the one I use most of the time. You can kind of see the size of it. They make them in different sizes. You can get gigantic ones like this. So the way a wet palette works, if we go over it quickly, is you have a sponge. It's a very thin sponge, and the sponge is soaking in water, and then you have some sort of paper on top of it where the paint goes on. I prefer, actually, I talked about earlier, parchment paper to go on top. They make specific paper for palettes, just palette paper, to go in these wet palettes. I actually don't like it for the paints that we use for miniatures. They're actually designed more for the heavy body acrylics, artist acrylics. The paints that most of us use to paint miniatures with, they're not the best thing to use with. It's going to be much better using parchment paper, so just get yourself a roll of parchment paper. I cut a bunch of sheets to the size of my other palette that I use all the time, so I just have a stack of these lying there. Whenever I need one, I just pull it out and put it on the wet palette. So how does the wet palette work? Let's go over that. So this is a look inside my wet palette. Now the amount of water you put in the palette, it varies depending from person to person, personal preference, but I just want you to kind of see that there's not just like a little bit of water soaking into the sponge. There's like water in here. It's almost floating. I could kind of see, I can wring it out, and there's actually a ton of water in here. So that's what you kind of want. I personally use like a filtered distilled water in here, just because I don't want any weird stuff growing inside my palette. You have the container filled with water with the sponge in it, and then on top of that you want to put a piece of parchment paper. So normally I have something cut to the full size, but this was just lying here. So if you just stick that in there, you'll kind of see it'll start absorbing the water, and then it's going to start to curl up on you like that. If you actually leave it, it will flatten itself out, but what I actually like to do is just stick it in there like that, and then I'll flip it over, and it will, air bubbles out, and it should just stick right down to the surface. You kind of don't want any of these air bubbles in, so I kind of laid it down haphazardly, which I normally don't do, but then now you just have this surface which to put the paint on, and it will absorb some water through the parchment paper, making sure the paint stays liquid and it won't dry out as fast. So if you live in a very hot environment, you definitely want something like this to prevent your paint from drying out quickly. I'm normally fine where I live, but this still helps. And again, I use it when I want my paints a little bit thinner because of the techniques I'm using. Just know, depending on your brand of paint, it's how quickly it's going to absorb water out of this. So if you have, say, I use the P3 paints a lot. If I leave a P3 paint on here overnight, I know the next day it's really not even going to be usable. It's going to have absorbed so much water, it's just going to be like a liquid mess. So, but maybe something like these Vallejo paints from Nocturna, they're a little thicker, and if I leave them overnight, they still will probably be okay the next day, but it just depends on what brand of paint you're using. You just need to be aware of that. The other thing that I always have with me is I just have this bottle, and it's just filled with water. So in case the palette's drying out a little bit, I can squirt some more water in there, or I can just put like a drop of water on here if I want to blend some water in with my paints to make them a little bit thinner. So that's just in addition to a palette. You almost always want to have this. I use it with my well palette, I use it with everything. Just keep a bottle of water handy so you can thin your paints when you want to thin them. The advantage of having the water bottle is, instead of, everyone has a paint cup to wash your brush out, this water is never contaminated with paint. It's always clean water in this bottle. Now that we know how the wet palette works, let's talk about why we use wet palette versus some sort of hard palette like this. if you're using metallic paints, use a hard palette like this. You do not want to use metallic paints in a wet palette because the metal flakes can kind of soak into the water of your wet palette and they're going to contaminate all the paints on the palette. So you really don't want metal flakes in the water of your wet palette. So if you're using metallics, go with a little well palette like this. Another thing you want to definitely use a well palette for is inks, contrast, or if you're making a wash, anything like that, anything that's very liquid or thin, you're going to want to go in here again, because if you put it in the wet palette, it's just going to soak right in the water and it's not going to work properly. So inks, washes, contrast paints, metallics, always use a hard palette and not the wet palette. The other time that I use a hard palette, you probably notice I use a hard palette a lot, is if you're doing different types of blending. So a lot of times I do what's called two brush blending. You've probably seen it in some of my videos where you put the paint on with one brush and feather it out with a separate brush. You want to have a very specific consistency of paint when you do that technique. So to do that, you want to be able to specifically control the consistency of that paint. So for that reason, I actually prefer this over a wet palette when I do that technique, because again, I want very good control over the consistency of the paint. So I don't want the wet palette where it's going to absorb more moisture in. And for that specific technique, you actually don't want the paint as thin. So this is the way to go for that. So wet palette is a very good tool, but it's just that, it's just a tool. It's not a be-all end-all. Sometimes it's better using this type of palette than a wet palette. Wet palettes definitely have their advantages. If you're doing something like if you have a bunch of different colors that you're working between, you want them all on your palette at once, or if you're doing very thin layers and feathering out and different types of glazing and techniques like that, you might want the wet palette so you have the consistency there. But again, it's not something you always need to use. If you watch my videos, sometimes I use the wet palette in the video, sometimes I do not. It depends on the techniques that I am using. So, like anything, you need to use the right tool for the right job. Like if I'm doing fine details and painting the eye of a miniature, I want to brush with a very fine tip. If I'm dry brushing, that is not the brush I want to use. I want to use a big wide brush because it's going to get destroyed and I don't want to destroy my nice brushes. Again, everything is a tool and you need to know when to use one tool versus another tool. So I kind of explain why you do certain things, but a lot of it is going to be just personal preference and just playing with it. You learn a lot by experimenting, so I would encourage everyone to just play around. If you don't want to buy a wet palette, they're not too expensive, but if you want to make your own, it's easy to make your own. You can just get either fold up a paper towel a couple times or get a thin sponge, put it in some kind of container with water, and then just put some parchment paper on top and you have your own very own wet palette. I just find it's easier just because this is not that expensive just to buy this. I hope you guys like these videos about the basics of painting, because having a good foundation is so important to building better techniques. Kind of the old saying, you have to walk before you run. If you don't know how to use the basic tools, you're never going to be able to build those good techniques. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them below. I'll try to answer them as best I can. If you found this useful, please leave a like. Subscribe here for new videos. And over here, I'm going to leave a link to my playlist of miniature painting basics so you can get an idea of some other stuff. So we've gone over brushes so far, we've gone over palettes, we've gone over miniature painting handles, I've gone over oil paints. There's some other topics I definitely want to cover in the future. If there's anything you guys would like me to cover, let me know down below. And until next time, keep on gaming and paint your minis.